Hello, everyone. And for those of you who are listening in close to real time, Happy New Year. Hope you and your family are having a wonderful holiday. We're going to talk today about whole life discipleship. Am I missing something? Helping us think through that is Dr. David Benson. He is a husband, teacher, pastor, founder, philosopher. He's a thinking and researching fellow on faith in the 21st century and Western culture. He was a lecturer at Malayan Theological College in Australia. He's a founding pastor of Christ Pieces in Brisbane, Australia. Now he heads up culture and discipleship at the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity. We're going to hear about conversations about real examples of real discipling communities. It's a fascinating walk. Helping us out today also, Carmen LaBerge. Carmen's back with us again. Faith Radio's own Carmen in the Morning host. We're grateful to have her with us on the co-host here while Raymond's up to his eyeballs and other things. So here we go with Dr. David Benson, the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity, and a great conversation on whole life discipleship.
To be honest, maybe I'm being harsh here. I am Australian, cut me some slack, but I feel like I don't really care how great a performer or a personal trainer is the person on the stage. If you are forming practices that focus on the front but don't actually engage everyone in giving and taking, learning how to give and receive love and to use their gifts, then we're not actually growing up into the head who is Christ.
I think I will start with we have what we have because we have trained it. We have created a process and a system, particularly when we talk about church leadership, that expects people to bank a lot of information and then regurgitate that through a practice that we have learned, a system that we have learned, which is that other people are going to sit and listen to me talk about the things that I have sat and learned.
And so I think when you look at the way that Jesus was doing it, basically he spent 3 years with not a particularly promising looking group of people, but he'd waited on the Father to get the direction of who to ask.
Dr. Dave Benson with the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity. Thank you for joining us on the Disciple Dilemma.
Hey, it's a pleasure to join with you, Dennis, and to join with you, Carmen. A couple of good friends of mine, I think, have been on the podcast before, so I'm coming with not fear and trepidation, but excitement.
And the ever ontological and sometimes agricultural Carmen LaBerge, Faith Radio's host, Carmen in the Morning. Thanks for riding along on this, Carmen.
Yeah, Dennis, thanks so much. Dave, I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Likewise.
Well, I'll tee it up. Carmen can follow up with some flow here as well. Dave, would you just start out with this LICC thing? What in the world is a London Institute for Contemporary Christianity, and how in the world does John Stott fit in here?
Yeah, great question, Dennis. So LICC was founded in 1982 by John Stott. So I imagine many of the people listening have a familiarity with John Stott, though he passed away a number of years ago. He was a really key Christian leader, not just in the UK, but really in the global church. Connected with the Lausanne movement, instrumental in many church movements, key in terms of evangelicalism, not just within Anglicanism, movements like A Rocha, Langham Partnership, etc., etc. It goes on. He was good friends with Billy Graham, and essentially what he looked at was he looked at the landscape and said there's pretty solid teaching for clergy. If you want to train as a pastor, minister, paid church worker, there's pretty solid training for you, though there's always room for critique. And there's quite solid training for if you want to be an engineer or a teacher, you want to work in aviation, whatever field it is, there's solid occupational training. But between theological training and occupational training, there seems to be quite a lack, a dearth of in-depth training for everyday Christians to live their faith in the whole of life. And John's passion was to see all of life integrated under the lordship of Christ. And so when Christ is Lord of all, then we are on mission 24/7. LICC was birthed 40 years on now. We have a team of about 30 people, and we have a strong communications team. We have a church team that works with church leaders to help train and equip every member of the church to look like Christ when they scatter. So we look at the gatherings to be intentional to scatter well. We have a workplace team to show how your faith and work relate and why your work matters to God. And I direct the culture and discipleship team. So I would say we're very much in the line of Leslie Newbegin, for those who are familiar with his work. We are trying to form missionaries where they already are.
I mean, in America, what we do to be really good disciples is we join churches. And I mean, what are you selling here, Dave? I mean, this thing about whole life discipleship, what are we missing here? What are you integrating into the faith in this world? And of course, I'm being provocative and a little bit silly in the way I'm setting up the question, but some people listening to this conversation are like, it's church, man. Get in church. That's the world. What's going on?
Yeah. I think one of the issues here is we would kind of, in one sense, like to drop the language of whole life disciple, because we would argue there is no other kind. It's a tautology. It's kind of an unnecessary, double use of a word. We would say to be a disciple is to be a follower of Christ, learning to follow the way of Jesus in your place at this time. And we might come back onto those dimensions of what it means to be a disciple. Christ called people to follow him to represent the reign of God in all of life. And we gather to be trained in that vision, in that character, and in that skill to be, I would use the language of a wise peacemaker, someone who gets the way the world is, has wisdom for everything to flourish, has the character of Christ, and has skillful hands to seek shalom, holistic flourishing. But simply joining a gathering of other Christians doesn't automatically shape you as a disciple. It really depends what you do when you gather. So we're saying, yes, be involved in the church, but the church is not a gathering. It's not a single place. It's not a building. The church is a called community to follow the way of Christ in the whole of life. And that takes intentionality.
I would just like to have like an Alleluia chorus. I don't know if that's appropriate on the Disciple Dilemma podcast, but you are speaking my language, and we are singing off the same page. So I am thrilled to be having this conversation. I think that maybe language that might resonate as you're listening to this, maybe language of, we're praying in the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. How are we actually functioning day in and day out as kingdom ambassadors of the king and the kingdom in the midst of the kingdoms of this world, and whatever kingdoms those are? So, Dave, I want to return to the language that you're using, learning. I was noting that disciple, language, learning to follow. That's active. That's not just sitting and it is listening, but it's not just sitting and listening. So learning to follow Jesus in my place at this time. So I want to talk about time and place. I want to talk about what it means to learn and what it means to follow. Can you just unpack some of that for us?
Yeah, well, I'll start with learning, and then we can see where we go. And I'm sure you guys want to jump in as well and add some of your own thoughts, because we each have different angles on that. I come from an education background. My first career was in high school teaching, and I spent a lot of time looking at what it means to teach and what it means to learn. And for me, healthy education and whole life discipleship are indistinguishable. So what I mean is, when we are forming a community of practice where we give and take, and we have accountability, and we learn and we grow, that's the stuff of discipleship. And yet, strangely, when I think back on the main forms of church expression I've experienced growing up, what I learned as an educator in terms of how people grow and how they engage, noting that the word mathetes for disciple actually means a learner. Like right at the heart of that word in the Greek is learner. And it doesn't distinguish between the disciplee and the disciple. It implies a community where you're growing together. And I would say in education that education is being drawn out of yourself to go from death to life as a community that's on a pilgrimage. But when I look at the way I would run a class, we would be interacting, co-constructing, questioning, making things. We'd be forming people in knowledge and understanding, in disposition or attitude, and also in skill. But then I look at what we'd often do on a Sunday gathering, and we had people looking at the back of each other's heads, essentially consuming a service for most of the time. We call it a service, but it seems that many people are serving it on the stage, elevated platform with technology as a kind of mediator between them and us. The focus on the front, the most active it would usually get is singing some songs. For me, that's terrible education. To be honest, I mean, maybe I'm being harsh here. I am Australian, cut me some slack, but I feel like I don't really care how great a performer or a personal trainer is the person on the stage. If you are forming practices that focus on the front, but don't actually engage everyone in giving and taking, learning how to give and receive love and to use their gifts, then we're not actually growing up into the head who is Christ. And therefore our formation is deformative, and it's not shaping us to scatter through the week and practice those same exercises. So there's got to be a connection between the exercises we do when we're gathered and what it means to follow the way of Jesus when we scatter. In my everyday life, when I'm called to follow Jesus, I'm dealing with plurality, secularism, consumerism, people turned in on themselves, mental health challenges. I'm dealing with a broken environment. I'm dealing with a love of experience in the culture. I'm dealing with dysfunctional workplaces where we don't really know each other. That's the game day. And if that's the game that Christ has called me to represent him in, I need to train that way when I'm there on Sunday so that I can actually live my faith in that time and place come Monday, this time tomorrow from the service. And so I think we really need to look at the degrees of freedom we have to be the church when we gather, so that we can have forms that are fit for purpose to shape disciples to look like Christ in the everyday contexts where they serve him, where they live, where they learn, they work, they play, they shop, they serve. These are the front lines where we regularly spend time with those who don't follow Jesus. And that's what I feel the church is there to do, to glorify God, but glorify him by looking like Christ, to represent him in the whole of life. And that points then to the kingdom. So that requires a pretty radical reimagine of what it means to be and practice the rhythms of the church in our typical gatherings.
I really like the direction that both of you are going with this. I like, your focus in and Carmen's emphasis on the learn to follow. So I want to just nudge the rudder a tad on this and explore something that is very dear to my own heart. So we think about sort of three levels of discipleship stages in the Hebrew tradition. We have the Bet Sefer, the Bet Midrash, the Bet Talmud. And for people who aren't familiar with that, I certainly wasn't until I got into trying to unpack what was going on in discipleship. Sefer is sort of like the fact absorption period. It's usually for young children. The Midrash, what we're doing is we're watching people like Dave and Carmen. We're listening to people like Dave and Carmen. We're kind of associating with them, and we're beginning to learn how they talk, how they speak, how they think. But the point of the Talmud, the Bet Talmud, is I'm actually following Dave and Carmen out into the real world. I'm watching how they interact with real people. I'm watching what they do in tough situations. I'm seeing them in the messiness of their life. And I've had some wonderful people in my own life do that. Now, what I want to ask both of you to talk to us about is not so much the duty of the individual disciple. I want you to talk to me about what you're saying to leaders about the culture that either suffocates or stimulates the Midrash and the Talmud, because I think we're really good at the Sefer. We deliver a lot of facts. We're great at TED Talks, technology, the Coldplay band. I mean, we get all that really well where people can see and experience. But I want you to talk to me for a minute, both of you, please, about what is it that you see in the UK, in Australia, and in the US around leadership's pros and cons to take me out into the world so that I'm learning how to mimic, imitate you, imitate Christ. What would you say about leadership in that world?
That's quite an assignment. I think I will start with we have what we have because we have trained it. We have created a process and a system, particularly when we talk about church leadership, that expects people to bank a lot of information and then regurgitate that through a practice that we have learned, a system that we have learned, which is that other people are going to sit and listen to me talk about the things that I have sat and learned. And so, I mean, we even, I mean, this is duplicated over and over and over again, even by the way that we expect people to take notes and then in turn maybe go deliver that same information in their small group. Like, that's the reproducing model that we've created, and it's the one that pastors have learned. So they're doing what they've learned to do. And so I don't want to be ungracious about pointing to the reality of the system that we have. I do recognize that pastors are frustrated. They're frustrated too. But you really can't imagine like this. The conversation of imagination is really the one that I think we need to have. Until it happens, until you see it, it's hard to imagine. It's really hard to imagine, Dave, what you're talking about when you talk about a community of practice. I would never use that language in relationship to the church that I attend, the church of which I am a part. And so part of it is the stumbling block of language. What is the church? Who is the church? And so when you use body language, when you use the language of the body, or when you use the language of family, or when you use the language of community, those are much more organic. They imply growth. They imply mutual growth. They imply that we all have a part to play. And that is not the language of the Western church, and it's not the model of the Western church, and therefore it's not what is modeled by leadership in the Western church.
Yeah, totally agree with you. I mean, I think when I think similarly, I notice language like where Paul says, "Follow me as I follow Christ," and the assumption is that they've actually watched Paul live. They didn't just hear him in the synagogue, but they saw him as a tent maker. They went into the hall with him of Tyrannus and watched him preach and engage in the marketplace in Athens. And there's all these stories together that are just emerging as they do life together. And you see that with Jesus. I think just like we want everything fast nowadays. I do know there's been a move towards slow church, as there's been a move towards slow eating and slow a number of other things. But we want kind of the hydroponic that will basically make the tomatoes ripe and look beautiful quickly, but the taste is terrible. It's we want everything to look right, but we don't have the patience to see the process that leads to a tasty piece of fruit. And so I think when you look at the way that Jesus was doing it, basically he spent 3 years with not a particularly promising looking group of people, but he'd waited on the Father to get the direction of who to ask. And he had maximum diversity in this group. And they did a lot of life together. If you think of the Japanese theologian Kasuga Kiyami, he basically said that we need to move at the pace at which we're transformed, which is walking with a 3-mile-an-hour God. God walks slowly with people. And as we journey, as we go on that car trip, as we head on that adventure, as we go down to the shops, as we do life together, using some of the slightly cliche, but I think still very rich language of being covered in the dust of your rabbi, is we would be so close to them that we would see the way they did things and be able to emulate it. I think the other thing is the Western approach to education often is both an empty bucket model, the empty head. We just need to fill it with ideas, and we assume that the ideas will flow down through the heart into action. But actually, anthropologically, theologically, looking at what it means to be human, that's just not the case. Our desires shape things much more. I'm a big fan of the work of Jamie Smith, particularly with You Are What You Love and his project on Desiring the Kingdom, the Cultural Liturgies Project, that what do you want seems to be a very key question that Jesus would ask often. What do you love? It's not, I think, therefore I am, in which case we could just give ideas and then it would translate into action. But we love, therefore we are. So how do we form a community that gives and receives love and that uses their gifts together? Well, that's a decentered community where people are actually able to lead and learn. So for us, I mean, we'll get into the practicalities in a moment of what that looked like in some of the communities that we've experimented with, but it meant doing things a lot slower. We can unpack later, but for instance, the church that my wife and I led, Christ Pieces, we would meet in a car park at 8 a.m. on Sunday, and we would take our picnic chairs and we would walk 800 meters down to an abandoned rock quarry on the Brisbane River, which was a natural cathedral. That was almost like the journey of descent and journey of ascent. We would talk and pray and debrief the week as we went down. We'd then set up in the round and we would be together for about 4 hours. And during that time, we would do serious scripture engagement. There was no one sermon. It was all done in the round. It was closer to an Indigenous storytelling circle in some ways. There would be open confession. We would have meals together. We would each share how we felt Christ was speaking to the church today to live their calling. We would pray into each other's front lines. We would have accountability. We'd meet over meals. We would volunteer together, partnering with the local Habitat for Humanity group and also the group that was a secular group just looking after the park that we were in. So it was a tight-knit community where it was open to others, but we truly knew each other, which meant you couldn't hide. And every week, different people would lead the liturgy, would lead the learning with the kids, would lead the Lord's Supper, and would also help open the word that we could learn together as God spoke. And so we had these core rhythms that were quite simple, but they each required you to give of yourself. We would say that pure consumption is a cancer. If all you're doing is consuming and you're growing by consuming, you may be getting bigger as a group numerically, but it's a metastasis. It's not a good kind of growth. You want growth that is organic, that leads to tasty fruit, and that requires giving and taking, requires patience. So for us, I guess your original question there, Dennis, it looked like doing life together, slowing it down, centering on those practices and means of grace where God said, I'll meet you in this place, where we could see the growth and we'd bring people's everyday life into those gatherings and commission them to go back to their places where they served so that they would know what it meant to see God at work and to join him in that in their everyday life.
Did you see people continuing to live out what you were telling them to live out in the years ahead, even now as you look back, some years going back? What sort of percentage, that's a terrible way to do this, but let me just do it that way. I'm a business guy. What sort of percentage of the population got it and started living that out?
Yeah. Well, I would say one of the things is, we only had, I guess collectively, probably about 70 people involved. It was a relatively small group, but we built it so that anytime you got more than 12 people, we would actually subdivide within that group so that there was maximum participation. So that way there was no free riding, because we felt that actually giving and take, contributing, receiving, the mechanics of love, that's what made for transformation. So we made sure that everyone was engaged in the forms that we had. I would say during that time, maybe I'm overstating here, but everyone that I spoke to who was involved across that period knew that they were loved, actually grew, and they put their faith into practice in really distinctive ways because we built those connections between everyday life and their faith. Every week without fail, it wasn't because someone preached well. We saw God speak through his word. Every week when we gathered and every person said, what is God saying to his church through his spirit? And what does this mean for us today? We would have, 45 minutes together as people are saying, here's the piece that I got. We journaled for 20 minutes. We read an Old Testament, New Testament chapter as we came back together. Here's the 1, 2, or 3 bits of the jigsaw that I got. And I didn't even know if my pieces are upside down, but I'm going to courageously but humbly put them on the table and you put your pieces there and let's see if a picture emerges. And always a picture would emerge that would be sufficient for us to have a vision of what it means to follow Christ tomorrow. And so we knew that Christ speaks. It's not because we could say, isn't, Dave or isn't, Andy, aren't they great teachers? It was because we saw Christ speak through the whole body. And so therefore I'll give you one story that was just amazing to me. We had 2 people in the group who really struggled to get along with each other, very different personalities. And they'd kind of come to loggerheads at a weekend away when we were partnering with an Indigenous community. And, one of them went to say goodbye and the other one turned their shoulder. And I'm like, oh, this is getting really messy. But then we got together the next Sunday and one of the people, the lady, had to lead communion. And she knows that when we do communion together, we have open confession and we actually make space to say, are there issues between us in terms of reconciliation? she didn't want to address it, but she knew there was no safe place to hide because she's involved in this and she's leading it. And we're going to take 15 minutes to do communion slow. And we're going to share of ourselves. You can't hide in this. And she was about to serve communion, and she just went to the other guy, her name's Poss and Andrew, but she just went to him and said, Andrew, I need to confess I haven't loved you in my heart. And it was the most powerful thing. Andrew, who, he may listen, but can be a little bit awkward socially at times. He just grabbed her hand and just started kissing her hand and said, I'm sorry, my sister, I'm sorry. And they just I get torn up here, but they just reconciled on the spot. And we were able to embrace them. And like when you have experiences of honesty and authenticity and service, people are transformed. I think we also saw some people many people who are non-Christian come along for discussions. I remember one week we were looking at, we had a set, lectionary, and these people came. They were just young adults who were involved in the animation kind of industry and very artsy, into game playing kind of stuff. And the readings were from Ezekiel and Revelation. And I remember having a word to the Lord, God, this is not the right set of passages for this person. This is not seeker friendly. And anyway, but we read the passages out loud. We split up for 20 minutes. We came back together, and I always try and give voice to the people who have the least voices. That's one of our principles. And I just said, that must have been the wackest thing you've ever read, right? Like, how'd you go? What did it look like to you? Because this is a wisdom source. You don't have to be Christian to read the Bible. What did you get? And his comment was, well, I'm into gaming and I actually love Norse mythology. And he said that felt a bit like Valhalla with Norse mythology, except it was different because it wasn't escapist, but it had hope. I said, oh my goodness, you've actually read apocalyptic genre better than most people I know. And then he engaged in the discussion. So I'm like, the word speaks, God speaks. His spirit moves when we make space for that. So I found that we did the practices that themselves were transformative, which gave me a confidence that when people scattered, they just needed to do much the same practices. Big fan of David Fitch's work, and in Faithful Presence, and also seven practices for the church on mission. He talks about the church in three modes: the church where God hosts us, and then we host others, and then the world hosts us. And then when we go to our workplace where we maybe don't have control, we can find people of peace who are hosting like that because of common grace, or maybe God's working on their heart, like Cornelius in Acts 10. And we can strengthen their arm and encourage them and show them where this grace comes from to live that way, and appeal to them as people of peace and call them to align with Christ as a source of what's true, good, and beautiful. So when there's a coherence between gathered, scattered, and sent together, they mutually reinforce each other. But instead, what we often have is we talk about it when we gather. We don't practice it together as we are sent together. And then we just trust that people will live out the faith when they scatter, but they haven't actually been formed in the practices when we gathered. So there's not that process of moving through those three stages of discipleship. You said there's a gap between the two, and that leads to either exhaustion, where we expect them to go and they just get tired, or it leads to maintenance mode, where we just do church, but we're not really engaged in a meaningful way. So we need to reconnect the three forms.
Would you help the church think more about discipleship? Would you help us get the conversation started to talk about the biblical discipleship Jesus gave us? Please follow us. Our website, www.thediscipledilemma.com. You can find us on YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and all the RSS feeds. If you'd follow or like us, you'll help us get leverage in the digital marketplace to talk about the fact that discipleship needs to be talked about. And as always, folks, thanks for listening.